1,200 years ago, the Vikings exploded out of the cold North Sea, like beasts unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. They came from the land of fjords, a land hard to farm and bitter clan rivalries, modern-day Scandinavia. Their story began in the late 700s in the uplands of Norway.
We do have some indications of what life was like before the Vikings took to the sea and began their raids. They tend to be a sedentary, agriculturally oriented people who were pretty much organized around villages or clans of some sort, probably familiarly oriented. The climate was colder than would have been in the rest of Europe. The weather could be brutal at times. It was probably difficult to stay alive, and that's an important point to make.
At the dawn of the Viking Age, the family farm was the basic economic unit of Norse life. As farmers and herdsmen, they planted grains and vegetables during the short growing seasons and relied heavily on livestock. But peace in the Northland was coming to an end. The expanding Viking population needed more fertile farmland, and tensions boiled over. Inevitably, violence flared between the Viking clans. As the stronger attacked the weaker, raiders fell on farmers with axes, swords, and brutal violence. Land feuds erupted with utter lawlessness.
Basically, a king was a man who had a big farm. The Vikings would run into the village, grab everything they could, take off again. It's not terribly sophisticated, but very effective.
Some Vikings, however, set aside their differences and prepared to seek their fortunes elsewhere. The hands and tools that once shaped the cross beams of barns turned to another task. Along the shores of the northern inlets, boats were built. Boats that changed the lives of these people. Viking longships. These extraordinary vessels, revolutionary in design, took history on a new course and launched an onslaught that dominated Europe and beyond for the next 3 centuries. In the longship, Vikings drew on generations of boat-building techniques and seafaring skills.
There would have been no Vikings without the Viking ship. And it is that evolution of that technology that allowed them to make such a mark on history. In time, they learned to make boats that were seaworthy enough to travel the North Atlantic. This was really what gave the Vikings their long reach. And if they wanted a boat to go up the rivers of Russia or in Europe, a raiding boat that might go into the heart of the continent, they could make the same style, the same construction technique, but just a small version. They were light enough to be carried over portages, they could be dragged up rivers, and they could be sailed. And that was one of the important features.
It's no longer a coastal vessel like many of the Mediterranean ones were. They would make the jump from Norway to Scotland, and from the Faroe Islands to Iceland, and from Iceland to Greenland. Over open waters, Vikings weren't frightened by this, and they had the technology to make it happen.
The result was a boat with a low draft and high adaptability, a technological marvel for its day. No single king or central government led these people. Each Norse village acted independently. Each declared its own king. The Vikings banded together on this bold mission, leaving women and children behind and taking to the seas. They were after plunder, so they armed themselves accordingly. Among the first victims of their raiding were the monks of Lindisfarne, home to St. Cuthbert's Monastery in June 793. Lindisfarne was one of the holiest places in the British Isles, rich with piety and with more tangible treasures.
These monks their bells are ringing, they're going to Mass, and up out of the sea come these dragons. And the Vikings came on them just like a storm.
The monks were met by hell. And they described it often as if the devils from hell are being unleashed on them. They were raiders. They weren't soldiers.
The Viking warrior was a very simple war machine. It was a big, brawny Scandinavian, often dressed in leather, hide, armor.
The monasteries along the coast particularly appealed to the Vikings because of their great accumulation of wealth and the passivity of the monks. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, begun in the late 800s, is the primary source of English history from the 5th to the 11th century. It records the terror wrought by the Viking invaders. The ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. This attack on these monks and their treasures in 793 AD was an historical milestone, the first major Viking sea raid. But Lindisfarne and the other vulnerable monasteries along the coast of the British Isles were only the beginning. As the 8th century drew to a close, the Viking raiders set their sights on larger prizes. The major cities of Europe were about to feel the power and the fury of these Norsemen and the bite of their steel. The Vikings left Scandinavia to plunder. The 793 AD attack on Lindisfarne sparked an inferno of Viking barbarism that threatened to consume all of Europe. By the middle of the 9th century, only 50 years or so after Lindisfarne, word of Europe's removable wealth had spread. Norse families, villages, and whole communities banded together to build longships. They planned to improve their situation at the expense of those across the sea.
All the Spaniards later, when they came to America, they were looking for gold, but the Vikings were looking for silver, and silver was the great thing to them, and a lot of the religious implements, crosses, and the various things that one finds in a monastery were made out of silver.
The Viking factions headed out across the sea with no single ruler to unite them. Even when their fleets swelled to scores of ships, each still acted independently, making the onslaught all the more difficult to stop. As the reputations of individual Viking leaders began to grow, so too did their ambitions. Europe was theirs for the taking. One of the first major river attacks came in 845 AD, at the hands of a notorious Viking leader, Ragnar, a Dane. With a fleet of 120 ships, he seized upon the legacy of Lindisfarne with a vengeance, using the Seine to attack Paris. Before they got to the city, Ragnar's Vikings decimated the French advance force on the banks of the Seine, marching their French captives to a hideous end. A local monk, Ermentarius, described the Viking onslaught and devastation that continued for decades along the Seine and Loire rivers. The number of ships grows. The endless stream of Vikings never ceases to increase. Everywhere, the Christians are the victims of massacres, burnings, plunderings. The Vikings conquer all in their path, and nothing resists them. The King of France, Charles the Bald, paid Ragnar nearly 6 tons of silver and gold bullion to get the raiders to leave and never come back. It had the opposite effect. As word spread that such loot could be had, that land and goods were everywhere, the pillage of northern Europe continued with a fervor. Between 790 and 1100 AD, Vikings followed every major river and water route into the heart of the continent. But for the Vikings, a new world awaited. Norwegians wrote perhaps the most colorful chapter in Viking history. As fearless explorers, they colonized Iceland and Greenland as they pushed further west. With this colonization came the story of two legendary Norwegian Vikings, Eric the Red and his son Leif Erikson. In the late 900s, Eric became the first to settle this unforgiving land. A fiery character, Eric was soon banished for 3 years from Iceland as well. He sailed west and settled on the east coast of Greenland.
The ground wasn't very tillable, but fishing was available and other meat was available. But it was a harsh land.
During Eric the Red's leadership, a Norse agrarian society scratched a living in this distant land. For government, the villagers convened at Althing, a kind of public assembly or court of law transplanted from their homelands. Here, free men had the right to speak in their defense and on issues of community concern. From this community of freemen came Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson. Like his father, he yearned to explore. In the year 1000, he set sail.
This is a fascinating thing and still very controversial in a way. Eriksson's village in Newfoundland has been carbon dated, for example, precisely to the year 1000 AD. So we know that Vikings were at least in Newfoundland.
The Greenlanders' attempt to settle here failed. The Newfoundland colony lasted only a decade. But 500 years before Columbus made his epic journey, Vikings had linked the eastern and western hemispheres. After wintering in Newfoundland, Leif Erikson returned to Greenland and introduced something new to the island settlers. With the same tools that built the longships, they built the rugged crosses of a new religion.
They decided that they would convert. Leif Erikson went to Norway, where the king asked him specifically to take Christianity to Greenland and to Christianize Greenland colonies, which he dutifully did.
As Viking influence spread, the wider world in turn shaped Viking culture. Their leaders saw Christianity as a means to unite the clans, and ultimately, to wield more control over them. At the dawn of the 11th century, 200 years after the attack at Lindisfarne, the Norse people still had no single king and little sense of solidarity. It was Christianity that presented a reason to unite. But the Christian Vikings experienced resistance from their pagan tribesmen to give up their ancient gods.